When I arrived in DC at age 18, it was like that scene in The Wizard of Oz when everything goes from black and white to Technicolor. I had spent my first 18 years in Ohio feeling like maybe there was something better out there for me, and what I found in DC exceeded my wildest expectations. I felt like I was finally becoming the person I was meant to be, like a sophisticated, worldly person who cared about the Middle East and knew how to use chopsticks and could hail a cab by just flicking my wrist. So when I found out at the end of my freshman year that there was no more money for college and I was going to be in Ohio for the foreseeable future, I was at a bit of a loss. I got my first job waiting tables that summer at a bar and marina called the Blue Goose. And the Goose was situated on the shores of a man-made lake at the end of a dirt road, nestled in the middle of a trailer park. And it was owned by a man named Larry, a former long-haul truck driver, and his very, very new, very, very young wife, Betty, whom he had met when she was a lot lizard, which is a prostitute who works at truck stops. And rounding out the management team that summer was Larry's son, Keith, a 22-year-old Liberace of a man who was confusingly dating one of the waitresses. And we also had Mikey, the racist bartender, and Pete, the cook, a 40-year-old man who was carrying on a very public affair with Betty's 14-year-old daughter. So to say that I was in a bad place in my life that summer is understating it quite a bit. I was living with my dad for the first time ever, and he's the one that helped me get this job at the Goose because it was part of his old stomping grounds. Back when I was around 7, right after my folks split up, my dad had been a bartender out there. And my sister and I spent a lot of our custodial weekends there. And while my dad worked, we'd play in the lake and drink Shirley Temples and run around. And when he got off work and started drinking, we would have potato skins for dinner and dance to all the bands that were playing and eventually fall asleep, sometimes at one of the trailers where the waitresses lived. And those nights, looking back, were really, really fun. But what wasn't so much fun were the rides home because, while my dad was a very fun drunk, he was not a very functional one. And those dark, curvy country roads at night are one of the most terrifying things that I can remember. I would buckle my sister into the back seat and then sit up front next to my dad as close to him as I could, and I would sing and talk as loudly as possible because he had a bad habit of kind of falling asleep behind the wheel. And I would never tell my mom what was happening because I was afraid that she would be mad and he would get in trouble and it would be my fault. And you know, those are the kinds of stories that lots of kids of alcoholics have, right? And while they may not have made me the most functional person, which you know if you've ever heard any of my dating stories, they do have one huge upside, and that is that I could make anybody like me. Kids of alcoholics learn to read a room faster than most people can shut the door behind them, and I was a master at that. I charmed the shit out of those waitresses my dad worked with because I knew I might need them. It was a survival strategy, and it worked. My sister and I reaped the benefits in quarters for the jukebox and potato chips and sometimes safety. And so when my own life went from Technicolor back to black and white and I found myself working at the Blue Goose, those old survival strategies came right back into play. I was a good girl. I needed Larry and Betty and the rest of those fools to like me, and to accomplish that, I worked harder than anyone else. I never got mad when Mikey told racist jokes, and I never once got into a fist fight in the parking lot, unlike the other waitresses. I was fitting in. Whereas in DC, I had worn plaid flannel and Doc Martens. At the Goose, it was booty shorts and Keds. In DC, I had read The Beauty Myth and been like, really, really mad about sexism? But at the... Yep. But at the Blue Goose, sexism was how 19-year-old girls made good money. In DC, I had seen Nirvana play right before Kurt died, and it was far and away one of the best days in my life. But at the Goose, my favorite song was Away Down Yonder on the Chattahoochee by Alan Jackson. And every time it came on, someone would say, oh my God, Cara, they're playing your song. And I would say, I know. So my survival strategy was working. And anyway, I was working so much that I didn't even have time to spend all the money I was making. When I wasn't working, I was asleep because I had no idea what I was supposed to be doing with my life now that I was no longer going to college in DC. That had been as far as my strategy for myself extended. So summers in Ohio are short and hot. And as they come to an end, people at the Blue Goose were getting even wilder and crazier than usual. And because it was a marina, we had this kind of core contingent of people who basically lived on their boats all summer, most of them single, recently divorced guys from Columbus who were kind of working out their midlife crisis by wearing Jimmy Buffett t-shirts and drinking too much. And as an adult, it looks different. Like, looking back, I know that a lot of those guys were younger then than I am now. And even when my dad was a bartender at the Goose, he wasn't even 30 years old yet. But from the vantage point of a 19-year-old, they seemed like adults. And I really felt like I wasn't an adult that summer and that the playing field wasn't at all level. So we had this one regular I really liked named Charlie Brown. Great name. That's his real name. Don't Google him. And Charlie had this daughter named Allie that he'd bring out a couple of times a month to spend the night with him on the boat for his custodial weekends. And when Allie was there, I'd give her quarters for the jukebox and teach her how to twist the cocktail napkins with a glass to make them fan out, just like the waitresses taught me. But then one Sunday they were there, and Charlie started ordering beers after lunch, which was a little bit unusual. And I thought, well, no big deal. Maybe Allie's mom is coming to pick her up. But she didn't. And then as the day went on, I thought, well, maybe they're just going to spend the night on the boat again. But at about 7 o'clock, Charlie ordered coffee and a sandwich, and I knew that he was trying to sober up so that he could drive Allie back home to Columbus, which was about an hour away. And that was a problem because I also knew how much he'd had to drink because I was his waitress and I'd served him. And so I knew what I should do. I should take Allie aside and get her mom's phone number and call her mom and say, come get this kid because it's not safe for her to get in the car with her dad. But Charlie was such a nice guy, and it would have caused a scene, and I wasn't the kind of person that caused a scene. I was the kind of person that everyone liked. That was my whole thing. That was my strategy for survival, and it worked. And so I'd like to say that I overcame that and did the hard thing and called Allie's mom and made a scene, but I wasn't really there yet. That summer I was kind of only a half-baked person myself, and so I gave Charlie his coffee and his sandwiches and kept them there as long as I could, but in the end, they left, and I let them go. And they were okay, but I really wasn't okay with the version of myself who let that happen, the version of myself I was at the Goose. And I knew I needed to do a lot more work to become the kind of person that I really wanted to be, and that I wasn't going to get that work done by waiting tables out there and living with my dad. So not long after, I left the Goose, and then I left Ohio, and I came back to DC and started trying to become, the best Cara foreign that I could. And 20 years later, the work continues. Some days are better than others. But what I do know about myself is that the person I want to be is not somebody who is walking down the road toward Oz, not cowering back in Munchkinland by that fallen house. And to that end, I have worked really hard to forgive us all for the stupid things we did when we were young at the lake during those short, hot summers. And when I think of Allie, wherever she is, I hope that she's forgiven all of us too.